Following this talk, there will be lots of opportunity for you to ask the panelists questions. Please submit your questions through the chat function, and I will then collate the submitted questions and put them to the panel on behalf of you following the presentation. So this is where my job ends, because we actually have a chair for this panel. So I'm now delighted to introduce you to our chair. And the chair is Professor Nicola Walsh. She is Executive Director of the newly launched UCL Center for Climate Change and Sustainability Education, a really exciting development within UCL's Faculty of Education and Society that aims to provide outstanding research-informed professional development for teachers and school leaders across all phases, subjects, and career stages. Professor Walsh is a geography education researcher, and with recent work focusing predominantly on environmental and sustainability education. Her research encompasses evaluation of pedagogies for effective teacher education in climate change and environmental and sustainability education, understanding children and young people's perceptions and value of sustainability and climate change, and the impact of nature connectivity and children's engagement with sustainability on their mental health and well-being. Without any further ado, it's over to you, Professor Walsh.
Thank you very much, Henriette. And I'm delighted to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me to take part in what promises to be a very interesting and very important event. So thank you very much. It falls to me to sort of open and set the scene a little bit for this event. So I'm going to start off by giving a little bit of a context for the discussion. And as Henriette said, I'm then going to hand over to various colleagues who will give different perspectives on the overarching theme of teaching the future now is our education responding to the climate challenge. And there will be plenty of time, as Henriette said, for questions. So at any point, don't feel the need that you need to wait until the end. Please do add them in. If there's a specific panelist, please signpost that so that we can make sure it's addressed by the correct person. But otherwise, of course, it can be much broader. So I am going to share my screen and, as I said, give what is a sort of a slight overview in terms of climate change and sustainability education in England, or the state of play, if you like. And what I thought I would do to really sort of go right back and set the scene is to give a little bit of a context, so give you a little bit of a history lesson in some respects. I'm not going to read out all of that, but just to remind us that this is not a new thing. Of course, climate change is talked about much more frequently, in particular the last 6 months, but actually the context of sustainability, sustainable development, and the term of sustainable development really dates back to the WCED Earth Charter and the Brundtland Report in the 1980s. And that definition, which many of you, particularly those who have been through a geography GCSE as a minimum, will remember. So meeting the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. And that Earth Charter was developed at a point when it was really the first time where policymakers and academics came together to talk about the environment in conjunction with the economy and development, and bring those two things together. And of course, many of the things following that you'll be familiar with, whether it be the Rio Earth Summit, which was a bit of a benchmark, and Agenda 21, which was a global and local effort, the Millennium Development Goals, which again broadly aligned with ideas of sustainable development, the UN Decade of Education for Sustainable Development, which was 2005 to 2014, and which really was trying to bring education to the forefront in context of sustainable development, but which actually a lot of research and work suggested that really failed in its mission to make sustainable development much more embedded within the educational system. And then Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which was replaced, if you like, the Decade of Education for Sustainable Development and the Millennium Development Goals, and really has been taken on board much more seriously by a sort of national organisations, NGOs, private companies, etc., and actually has filtered its way down into education as well. And then, of course, at the bottom there, COP26, and a real explosion of interest given the urgency and the now overpowering research that's suggesting that we need to do something to act now. So it's urgent now, but it's not something that's new. And it's kind of like, how do we start through education to turn that around and make people listen? And what I also wanted to do was suggest there are ways that this has been explored in education as well, because of course we're talking about education today. And it's not even within the educational sphere a new idea. There was as back as far as the 1970s, things like Mark Terry's ideas about teaching for survival and the handbook for environmental education, the Stockholm Conference, Eco Conference, the limits to growth work as well. In the 90s then, we had started to develop that. The rhetoric started and discourse started to get a little bit more serious, and people started to talk about this limits of growth, and equity and efficiency are not barriers, not obstacles, not threats, they're guides to the new world. So the discourse started to get a little bit more urgent. And yet now, as we come to the current context, a lot of the literature, and particularly the more popular literature, which in itself is a kind of hint as to how much more serious it is and more mainstream it's become, we've got the words such as surviving the climate crisis, the future we choose, the next 40 years being critical, dangerous years, David Attenborough's words as well. So really key in terms of knowing and recognizing that this is not a situation that we've suddenly realized, but actually it's a context over which the urgency has been developing, and yet some people would argue that we've still not got it right, we're still not addressing it, particularly through education. I just want to also reference sort of the wider work of people like UNESCO, who are now starting to talk about education for transformation, and the fact that actually it's not just about teaching about sustainability and climate change, but actually we need to transform the planet, through transforming our education systems. And there's some examples here, and Stefania Giannini, the Assistant Director General of UNESCO in 2020, talks about changing the way we think and act. So education must change to create a peaceful and sustainable world, and trying again to bring that urgency in and talking a lot about the changes. I did just want to, before I moved on, reference quickly, I've been talking just in those last few minutes, I talked about environmental education, I talked about education for sustainability. And of course, one of the things that has been complex and not helped in education is that there's a range of names. And of course, climate change isn't even on this list, because historically climate change wasn't talked about within education. There was sustainability education, education for sustainability, education for sustainable development, environmental education. And of course, one of the issues, and some people have argued, is that because we can't pin down, we can't define, and we can't agree on what we're talking about, that hasn't helped when we're talking about how to put that into education. I quite like this definition in terms of sustainability, or education for sustainability at the bottom, the Evans definition from 2017 though, but it hints at the complexity. So it talks about the knowledge, which of course is fairly straightforward in terms of a curricular focus, but also the understanding, the skills, the values, the capabilities, the dispositions. So education, which encompasses sustainability and also climate change, is complex. It doesn't just cover the knowledge. We need to think about, as teachers and educators, how we include all those other elements, which of course, again, makes it complex and difficult. So what about in England? And I'm deliberately using the word England because, of course, the different jurisdictions deal with this very differently. And I don't want to neglect the other areas, but I haven't got time to talk about them all. So I think it's of relevance that Scotland tends to be doing more, Wales tends to be doing more than England. But in terms of England, a report just a couple of years ago by Minister Blackman and Heather King talked about the limited and patchy coverage of the environment in national level education policy. And where the education is present, the focus is on about the environment rather than a more holistic approach that includes education for the environment. So no action, no social justice, etc. And of course, very recently, in response to COP26, or launched at COP26 as a draft, the UK government have started to address that. So they've got the Department for Education has our new sustainability and climate change strategy, puts tackling climate change at the heart of our education system. They talk in that about world-leading approaches to climate change and sustainability education, and the wish to sort of start to be excellent and then develop that more internationally as a kind of best practice model. And of course, that's been responded to, and various academics have spoken about what that means. So what schools need to know, we're trying to translate it basically, for those of you that are less familiar, talks about having climate leaders awards, about having a national park where the school grounds become a national park and increase biodiversity, etc. And of course, there are inevitably questions. Has this gone far enough? Is this enough? It incorporates the natural history GCSE, of course, and what does that mean? And again, questions have been raised. Just before I finish, the next thing I just wanted to do is we'll say, well, what is the state of play in schools? And just to refer to a little bit of research, again, I'll be brief, but there's not much research in the area of what's actually being done in schools, and increasing amounts as to what the issues are. So I'm not going to refer to academic literature though, although there's a little bit, but not very much, but reports by people such as Teach the Future, who have been really leading the way in trying to understand what teachers are feeling about climate change and sustainability education. And of course, we get figures such as 70% of teachers have been given no training on any aspects, or say that they've been given no training around climate change, for example. Another, that's Teach the Future, UKSCN, Oxford have similar findings. 75% of teachers responding to their survey said they didn't feel they had adequate training. And these are all disciplines, I think it's important to say. 92% of teachers said more needs to be done to address climate change in schools. Another survey by SOS UK, which of the following are embedded in your school's curriculum in your subject in a meaningful way? So 33% said climate change was embedded, but only 51% said none of them, so about the ecological crisis, climate change, and challenges for humanity. And this was reflected also in some of the work that we commissioned by Public First, which had various strands. So one was a survey looking at parent polling, and parents said, which is quite interesting, that the need to protect our environment and climate was the most important of these issues here, of things to their child. So more important than crime and violence, more important than discrimination faced by women and girls, for example, or inequalities. They also said that more children than any other topic their child has spoken to them about the issue of the need to protect the environment and climate. So parents are saying that it's really important. They also undertook focus groups with teachers, school leaders and young people. Everyone agreed that climate change and sustainability are important. The vast majority of parents thought it was important that their child was taught about it, but teachers were then telling us that they felt unprepared for teaching about it. They're afraid about teaching about it because they don't have the right resources or the right skill set, and they would worry that they'd add to the high anxiety levels. And young people were telling us that they're concerned about the amount it's taught. They were saying it wasn't taught enough and the quality of the teaching. They felt teachers were not interested in teaching. Teachers were saying they are really interested in teaching, but they weren't being supported. And school leaders were saying that actually it's not sufficiently on the agenda, the accountability agenda for them. So we have this real melting pot of what's happening in terms of people wanting more, but not feeling within the context of their current system that they're able to. So very quickly, my final thing I want to say is just to signpost, and that's very much where this Centre for Climate Change and Sustainability Education comes from at UCL. So we want to offer, as Henriette said, professional development, free professional development for teachers of all disciplines, because we very much feel it's beyond science and geography. It's for teachers of all disciplines, of all phases, so primary and secondary, and all career stages. So initial teacher education through to senior leaders. We're working in partnership with national and international partners to achieve this. So it's very much bringing together the huge amounts of effort that's happening within academia, but also NGOs, subject associations, schools, young people all together. And then underpinning that by research of our own around education, but also research in disciplines. So we have climate scientists or geographers or psychologists or historians contributing those resources. And this is very much what underpins our principles. So it's the whole curriculum, it's subject specific, and they'll have the knowledge, but also the knowledge about how to address that within their in particular disciplines without creating this climate anxiety I referred to. And of course, the pedagogy, the teaching and learning and how this is taught is important. And I'm going to finish off with quotes from the children, the primary on the left and a secondary on the right, because I think I always like to finish off with words from children and young people, but it can be a bit depressing. We need more positive stuff. We need to have hope. But I would argue we need to have hope. We need to do it quickly. And I'm very pleased to introduce and finish that by introducing our first guest, who's going to start thinking about this from a slightly different perspective. So Emily will be our first speaker this evening. So Emily Verner. Emily is an MPhil Development Studies student at the University of Cambridge, a campaigner at She Changes Climate, and the Youth Advisory Panel at the Global Centre on Adaptation and the Future Leaders Network at COP26 delegates. So I'm absolutely delighted to invite Emily to give quite a different perspective, I'm sure, from the context that I've given. Thank you very much, Emily.
Thank you very much, Nicola, and it's a pleasure to speak here today and be part of such an important dialogue on education and climate action. So as Nicola said, I'm Emily and I'm a master's student at Jesus College, and I'm also a climate and youth engagement campaigner. And my campaigning particularly centres around giving young people a voice, giving them opportunities, and in particular the skills and knowledge to take empowered and informed climate action. So over the last few years, I've worked actively with organisations such as the Future Leaders Network and the Global Centre on Adaptation, both of which have capacity building and education at their core, to develop opportunities and to be part of opportunities that enable the next generation of future leaders on climate action. And having been lucky enough to benefit from the opportunities and the skills and the training through these organisations too, I really cannot emphasise enough how important and transformative climate education is for young people, in particular for their mental health, for their progression, and for their capacity to flourish in what is a changing world, a changing job market and society. So I'd like to take my time today to speak to both why climate education is important for young people, but also how students like myself and potentially others of you in the audience are crucial actors in creating the momentum and the awareness and holding educational providers to account on its commitments to provide accessible climate education. Okay, so let's start with why climate education for young people. The importance of climate education is repeated to us throughout our school life. From primary school through to higher education, we are told that that education unlocks doors to new worlds. But we must question, what worlds do we want young people to be given access to? And based on our current education systems, I would argue that young people are only able to unlock doors to a world where it's business as usual, because the curriculum, the vocational skills, the teacher capacity building, and the funding to unlock doors to flourish in a more sustainable world are just simply not in place. So I'm going to start by rewinding a few years and set the scene back when I was in school. And beyond a couple of science and geography classes, most of which were non-compulsory and not accessible beyond those who'd taken the optional GCSE module in geography, I learned very little about climate change at all during my formal education. And what I did learn was framed around climate change as a future problem. As Nicola said, there were typical scientific references, particularly of polar bears on melting ice caps far removed from my classroom in Gloucester. And so there was this sense of disconnection and also lack of understanding. But I do remember feeling eco-anxiety at the information I did learn and the bits I would pick up in the news. So when the opportunity came to run for school parliament, I eagerly signed up to be on the Ministry of Environment, wanting to take some form of action. So there I was, knowing very little about climate change at all, in particular the politics of it, the social impact, how to actually take action. Yet I was in a position where I was supposed to lead meaningful action within my own school. And albeit I was a teenager and this was a mock role in the school parliament, but I think the story acts as a useful metaphor for a much wider problem. And that is, our generation will be taking on an increasingly number of green jobs, of climate action roles across all sectors. But we are going into these roles without the knowledge and skills of how to do this effectively. So how does this connect to the wider picture? As Nicola mentioned, a lot of research has been done into how students and teachers feel about climate education. And some research carried out by a social mobility charity, Speakers for School, found that 63% of young people said they know what green jobs are, but over half of them didn't feel that they know what the required skills and qualifications are to actually get one. Research by Force of Nature that Nicola touched upon reveals that 70% of young people surveyed experienced feeling a sense of hopelessness when they thought about climate change, and only a quarter of participants agreed that they actually knew how they could contribute to solving climate change. And finally, from a teacher's perspective, Teach the Future have shown that 90% of teachers agree that climate education should be compulsory in schools, but 70% feel they've not received adequate training to address this. So most respondents were indicating that they want it taught beyond geography and science classes, this whole curriculum approach that was mentioned. So even from just these top line stats, you can draw some key themes that I'd like to briefly dive into. And that's firstly that young people and teachers want a broad-based climate education, and this ranges from emotional and mental health aspects, which I really think are crucial, through to the science, through to the vocational skills that actually help them attain the green jobs. And I'm sure, as Nicola mentioned, some of you have seen the Department of Education's climate and sustainability strategy that was announced on Earth Day. But many young people feel that this does not yet contain the measurables and the deadlines to meet the urgency of the action that's needed. For instance, the new GCSE in natural history, which is a core element of the strategy and was very prominent in a lot of the news headlines, cannot be seen as a substitute for more inclusive climate education that's threaded throughout the curriculum and starts much earlier than GCSE level. So I really think that social mobility and accessibility need to be really core to these discussions, and that we need to be talking about climate education that starts much younger at a mandatory age such as primary and Key Stage 3, so that it doesn't end up in siloed subjects and relies on teaching capacity in order to actually be enacted. So whilst thus far I've spoken about the need for climate education in primary and secondary schools, university students like myself, often working in partnership with younger students, I feel have played a really key role in pushing for this change and lobbying educational providers. And this has led to the momentum and the accountability that's had these issues tabled nationally and even internationally. So I'd like to quickly go into a couple of these campaigns as examples. So some of the amazing delegates at Mock COP, which is a group of young people who gathered together online when COP was postponed in 2020, were the driving force behind convening some of the pledges at the Together for Tomorrow summit at COP26. And this summit convened environment, education ministers and young people as equal partners and pushed education ministers to make pledges on climate action, including the UK announcing its draft strategy. The Teach the Future campaign, which is a campaign composed of students from nations across the UK, is campaigning for the rapid reorientation of the education system around these climate, social justice and sustainability goals. And their climate education bill, which has really importantly been written by students and led by a young girl called Scarlett Westerbrook, who is the youngest known regular policy writer in parliamentary history, is now awaiting its second reading. So it's showing that these things really can have momentum. And then there's other youth organisations such as the Future Leaders Network, which I'm a part of, which tries to offer young people the vocational tools and opportunities to engage in ways that may not be possible if they're not currently getting it within their formal education. So ways to engage within climate action spaces. So I guess the key takeaways here is that young people's campaigning does represent a real hope for teaching the future in schools, crucially in a way that allows young people to be part of the process of shaping this new curriculum and driving its momentum and holding educational providers to account. And I think this is a really, really crucial moment with the launch of a lot of these strategies, with the aftermath of COP and the conversations looking towards COP27 to really drive some change. So I'm really excited to hear from the other panelists and the discussion at the end to kind of see where we can take this. Thank you, Nicola.
Thank you so much, Emily. Really interesting to hear the perspectives and the sort of action that is being taken from the student body and young people. Really, really important, I think, in actually impacting some of the work of the DFE, even in them listening to the voices of children and young people and starting to do things. So thank you, really interesting. Again, do put questions in the chat if you have anything particularly you want to ask Emily. The next speaker I'm delighted to welcome is Amy Munro-Fore. Amy, or Dr. Amy Munro-Fore, is the Engagement Manager at Living Laboratory in Cambridge Zero at the University of Cambridge, which sounds really interesting. And sorry if I've not done justice, Amy, to that introduction, but very much looking forward to hearing more about your work. So thank you, Amy.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Nicola, and I'm delighted to be here and to say a few words about this. So I'm going to be taking more of a Cambridge lens on these issues. I'm going to talk a little bit about why this is so urgent, how it's going to touch all of our lives, and the role that Cambridge needs to play in terms of using its undoubted strength to make a change in this place. So first of all, wait, can we move this forward? Here we go. I always like to start with something like this. It's just to focus our minds on how urgent this is. And I'm sure many of you will have seen this animation before, but it shows how surface temperature has changed since 1850. Oh, hang on a second, my transition wasn't working. There we go. Let's try that again. It shows how surface temperature has changed since 1850. And the reason that I'm showing this is because it shows that this problem is happening. It's been happening for a long time, and it's starting to happen increasingly quickly. We've not yet managed to do anything about it, and it's up to us and the resources that we have available to us now to actually try and do something about it. I always find it a bit shocking coming back to it. I haven't watched it for a while. So we've got a big problem. I hope I don't need to articulate exactly what that problem is. I think you're all here, I think you're all aware of it, but we're going to need to change how we generate power, heat our homes, how we travel, how we make things and decarbonize industry, what we eat, sorry, my slide transitions are all over the place, how we use our land, and how we adapt to living in a changing environment. So that's a whole bunch of problems that affect and touch every single part of our lives. And we're thinking about students now, be they young children in schools, be they children in secondary schools, be they students at Cambridge, who I'll come on to in a little bit more in a bit. Their lives, whether they choose to be interested in climate change or not, are going to be affected by all of the changes that we are going to see, whether that's the weather changing around them and implicitly changing every part of their life, or whether it's the changes that we're going to need to make societally to mitigate against climate change. This is something that's going to be coming up against, that they're going to be coming up against, irregardless of the personal choices that they make now. And I think that we as educators and people who work in educational institutions have a responsibility to provide them with both the skills they need and the knowledge that they need to navigate that world, but also the resilience, the adaptability, the imagination to be able to not just cope and have green jobs, but to lead lives that are as good as we would want them to be. One thing I often think about is that what the world looked like when my grandmother was born. She died last year, she lived to be 98, and what my life might look like at the end of the century if I lived to be 98. And if I look at the climate change projections, it really scares me. And I think about, okay, what would I want this world to look like? How do we educate people to ensure that they can lead those lives in the ways that we would want them to? The next point I'm going to make is that this is something that needs to happen really fast, and it can happen really fast. So this is a slide showing a transition, which was New York in 1900 and New York in 1913. And again, apologies for the slide transition. And as you can see, you went from the horse-drawn carts being 99% of the vehicles to horse-drawn carts being 1% of the vehicles in 13 years. So this is something that can happen fast. We can see these societal and technological changes to resolve problems if we're ready for it, and if we're able to bring people on board quickly enough and educate them to be able to take it up very, very fast. So this is something that can be done fast. Which moves me on to Cambridge and the role that Cambridge, I think, can have to play in this. Now, Cambridge as an educational institution, as lots of you will be aware, is in many ways a completely amazing place. There's wonderful teaching, there's brilliant students, and there's loads and loads of researchers who are doing stuff that's really, really at the cutting edge. It's also a difficult place sometimes to make change. It's bureaucratic. It's been teaching in the same way for hundreds of years. And there are certain elements of curricula which haven't changed in a very long time. I studied natural sciences as an undergrad, and I don't believe that the natural sciences lecture timetable has changed in that time. And that was about 15 years now. And I believe had not changed in substance for some time before that. So it can be a bit slow, and yet it brings together brilliant students with brilliant teachers, and those students go on and do fantastic things. And some of that teaching is absolutely incredible. So I think that there's a real challenge, a really exciting challenge here, which is actually we've got this huge problem that's going to touch all the different parts of our lives, touch all of our students' lives. We've got excellent teaching resources. And then I think there's a really exciting problem of, okay, we've got all these disciplines. We've got science, we've got English, thinking a lot about English at the moment. We've got the education faculty, we've got engineering. I think there's a really interesting question, which is, okay, how do you take the challenge that we've got in front of us and ensure that the both the knowledge that's been raised before and the skills that students are going to need are embedded throughout all of that teaching. How can we do that in a rigorous way? How can we go to the different departments who may at this point not believe that their content has anything, or the teaching they deliver has anything to do with climate change, and say, actually, where are the intersections? How do we do that rigorously? How do we lead in this? How do we say, okay, in English, where are the intersections between climate change and the paper that you're teaching in 18th century history? How do we pose that question? How do we ensure that if it is posed, that there's an answer, that when students come and raise these questions, there can be a nuanced discussion, and a discussion that's critical, that involves systems thinking, that really, really begins to get into these questions. So that's, I think, the challenge that I think Cambridge in particular has, is that we've got this entrenched bureaucratic system and we've got this challenge. And I think there's a really exciting opportunity at the nexus of those two things to think about that in a very rigorous way. And that's one thing that I'm really excited to start doing through my work at Cambridge Zero. I'm going to point out there's lots of really cool stuff already going at the university. I've only highlighted a couple of examples here because to go through all of them would take a very, very long time. So one example is Robert McFarlane, who probably needs no introduction, who's professor in the English faculty. And another example, this is a research-based example, that is from the engineering department, where very recently some Cambridge engineers invented the world's first zero carbon cement, or zero emission cement. And the reason that I'm showing you these, and although there are many, many other examples, is that I'm not saying that we're at ground zero. We've already done a bit, and some of the other panelists have already talked about some of the stuff that's already been done. But what I'm trying to say is, with the piece about transitions and how transitions can happen fast and the urgency of this problem, is that I think there's a lot more that we could do a lot more quickly, and do it in a rigorous way to send these students out into the world with the set of skills that they need to solve this problem, because they are going to be the ones who are going to help solve it. I'm going to finish off by showing you a couple of slides of some recent survey work that we've done with students in the university here, as that's my particular lens. And there are about 650 respondents to this survey. And these students, when we break it down by whether they agreed with the statement, there is sufficient course content around sustainability and climate change in my degree, as we can see, 3/4 of them did not agree with that statement. They felt neutral, they disagreed with that statement, which creates, I think, quite a strong signal of the fact that students want this. This is something that students are very aware of, and that there is an opportunity there to provide more and to do more urgently. And this is where I'm going to finish, because I think it's quite interesting going back to the points that have been made already about intersectionality between subjects and climate, but also the kind of real need that there is to think through, to think through this in a very, very holistic way. When we ask students, what topics would you like to learn more about within climate change and sustainability as part of your degree course, this was the range of responses that we got. And this is after they've been coded. So they had a free text, and this is how we coded them. And they really do cover everything from physical climate science to climate science solutions, to psychology and behaviour, to environmental policy, to the health sector, to environmental interpretations of materials and the humanities. This is a real source of interest and I think possible rigour for these students. So that's all I was going to say. I was going to finish off just by saying, again, this is urgent. This is going to touch every part of our lives. And I think that universities, and through my lens, Cambridge in particular, is going to need to play to its strengths, which are ones of excellence in education, and to drive this agenda forwards in an ongoing way. I'm going to stop sharing there.
So much, Amy, really interesting. I really found that last graph particularly interesting because, of course, it echoes what the teachers and the children and young people are saying in terms of the importance of a really interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary approach whereby climate change and sustainability is embedded in all disciplines, not just left to the climate scientists. So really helpful. Thank you for that. Okay, I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, Catrin Darsley, Catrin is Lucy Cavendish College member and Faculty of Education PhD researcher in Education for Sustainability in UK higher education institutions, and will bring a different lens again to our wider debate. So I'm very pleased to welcome Catrin. Thank you very much for coming this afternoon.
Thanks, Nicola. Yes, so as Nicola mentioned, I'm going to be speaking to you today from the position of a PhD researcher interested in this field within the UK university context, looking at how universities can be part of the solutions needed for the climate, biodiversity, other sustainability challenges that we're all facing. My research design, I'm actually just realized I'm not sharing my screen. Bear with me. There we go. My research design is looking at speaking to students, staff, other people within the university space, and hoping to connect the way that we teach with how universities can be part of developing competencies for sustainability. So I looked at various UK universities and looking at how whether sustainability was part of modules through to integrated across whole institutions, what competencies, what knowledge, skills, attitudes and values students were taking away. This one. So I realize if you're joining for this event that you probably have an answer to this already, but why is this topic so important? The term Anthropocene, as you may know, was coined by Nobel laureate Paul Crutzen. And it's describing a new geological era, essentially where humanity is the predominant drivers of change to the planet's geology, climate, and other ecosystems. Humanity, we've already changed these, but unless significant changes are made, then how we live, catastrophic changes are going to happen. We're already seeing things such as droughts, fires, food and water insecurity, increases in vector or insect-borne disease, extreme weather events, and related illnesses and inequalities, and these are being felt most significantly in the global south. Education is just one aspect of what we need as a society or as a global answer to improving on some of these challenges. And social, economic, environmental issues relate to every single academic discipline. So why am I focusing on higher education? Well, my research focuses on HE because it's my professional background, but also because I feel passionately this is a point in students' lives when changes to beliefs and behaviors can make a real impact. So when we leave university for the real world, and I say that as leaving studying rather than any implicit insult to any academics in the room, essentially we take knowledge, skills, attitudes and values developed during our studies with us. And these will shape how we approach future careers, as well as our relationships outside of work. So it's universities' duty to educate future professionals to support society in working for a more sustainable future. In the word of these academics, in higher education, we educate people that will shape future society. And as Nicola mentioned, the transformation of education and society, surely higher education is integral to that. So placing my research very briefly in a theoretical space, building on pragmatic theories from John Dewey's earliest 20th century research, and so he looked at particularly experiential education and democracy, and then more recently on Geert Bieste's views around what good education is, and the relationship between curriculum and society. I'm considering the potential for sustainability education to support key skills and competencies for graduates and society. So here, Bieste places good education at the meeting point of providing students with qualifications, as well as helping them to grow as an individual and engaging those students in societal cultures and norms. And as has been defined already, I think it's fairly easy to see how this could map onto the idea of education for sustainability. Another common definition is from the QAA and HEA, and ESD, or Education for Sustainable Development, is the process of equipping students with the knowledge and understanding, skills and attributes needed to work and live in a way that safeguards environmental, social and economic well-being, both in the present and for future generations. And you can see there how it links very clearly into the widely commonly used definition of sustainability, but through an educational lens. So there are diverging approaches to how educating for sustainability can be perceived. So you have the knowledge-based approach, and this links in very clearly with what we've already heard in terms of maybe how climate change relates to a specific discipline, projects that look at tangible outcomes that relate to the environment, economy, or society. Moving beyond that knowledge about sustainability then, how can we start to think about those competencies, those knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values that students gain? And this type of teaching seeks to scaffold learners, their different dispositions in a way that will support them across various complex situations and challenges. These can, of course, be combined, and with sustainability potentially offering a theme to develop these related key competencies that will allow people to act for a sustainable future. So when I mention key competencies, I pick up on the UNESCO definition, which is that they are cross-cutting competencies that are necessary for all learners of all ages worldwide, developed at different age-appropriate levels. Key competencies can be understood as transversal, multifunctional, and context-independent. They do not replace specific competencies necessary for successful action in certain situations and contexts, but they encompass these and are more broadly focused. So these 5 are picking up from what the literature has identified as key competencies that bring all of these things together, that enable people to work for a sustainable future. Critical thinking skills, I'm sure needs no definition, but enables people to develop their own positions, their own ideas. Systems thinking sees interconnections and possibilities. Interdisciplinary thinking allows for working across and between fields. You could think about that as multidisciplinary as well. Values thinking sees the self as part of maybe a bigger picture. It recognizes differing value sets, and it helps individuals to want to act for sustainability. Strategic thinking, finally, allows you to imagine a desired future and how to work towards it. And I think all of these are part of that capacity building that Emily mentioned. So that might be enough of the theory, but one of the main gaps in the literature, I think, is actually hearing students' voices. And what do current university students think about the role of the university and what knowledge, attitudes, and values they need for their future? I'll preface the following slides with, of course, it's just a snapshot, and more research as ever is always needed. So what do you see as being the most important values and attitudes you need for your future? These were gained through interviews and focus groups. And the first one was actually one of the very few knowledge-based aspects, which I thought was interesting, but ethical approaches to CSR, and this came from a business student. And then there was a clear steer towards an interest in seeing the development of ethics and values, communications and critical research skills, critical thinking, and the ability to consider opposing perspectives before making one's own decisions, resilience and being open-minded to new ideas, and then finally learning to work alongside other disciplines. So we can map those ideas and those things that came directly from students back onto those 5 key competencies, and they all have a place there alongside the critical research skills and communication that people mentioned. All of these things can be found within that idea. And I think part of my thesis is I want to draw up arguments to extend beyond the current models to incorporate student perspectives from these interviews and focus groups, as well as other collected data, and hopefully start to kind of bring some of the students' perspectives back into the literature as well. In terms of the role of the university, I'm not going to read this whole thing, but this ecology student sees the role of a university as being to prepare students to be forward-thinking and to nurture a sense of yourself as part of a bigger picture. And they felt that as it's a topic that does affect everything, it should be an overarching theme across their time at university. We asked in focus groups what sustainability meant to participants, and they defined it as encompassing environmental topics, as you could expect, such as water quality and biodiversity protection, as well as things like the need to be collaborative and multidisciplinary. You can see in the picture to the right of the screen, some of the other topics were around, thinking about sustainability as impacting on the future, student impacts, how did they as students feel that sustainability is important to them? And then also this politics and international relations student sees sustainability as a driver to teach students to be change agents, both to have agency and also how to act upon it. And I think that's quite an important aspect. So when asked to identify and design their ideal course, this example from a history and philosophy of science, not really spelled out there, but a history and philosophy of science student at a focus group, they had highlighted 5 aspects to good quality education for sustainability. There's direct climate and sustainability related content and taught programs. There's using the topic as reading material, something that people directly have to engage with as part of their degrees. There's creating new papers or modules as required, bringing it into careers guidance, and encouraging extracurricular engagement. Finally, just my question to you really, how can this be part of what you're taking forwards? So challenges to improve education for sustainability now. Can you consider how related topics, themes, skills, and values can be part of your subject? You can seek opportunities to enable multidisciplinary intersectional projects and learning. And can you seek opportunities for real-world learning, looking at projects within the wider area? And you could potentially consider discussing these with course leaders if you're a student, or get permission to integrate it while drawing on student leadership if you have a teaching role. And if you do have a strategic function, how can you develop these within your teams? And that's my final question for you. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Catrin. Really interesting, again, perspective and drawing out the skills, values and attitudes around sustainability and climate change as well, which is really interesting as opposed to the kind of more disciplinary content focus that I talked about. So thank you. Last but certainly not least, I'm delighted to introduce our final panellist, Sue James. Sue has a long list of accolades, but I'm going to summarise by saying she is a member of the Teach the Future Adult Advisory Board, and I referred to Teach the Future work earlier in my presentation, but also a chartered architect and advisor on the built and natural environment. So thank you so much, Sue, for being here this afternoon. I very much look forward to hearing what you've got to add to the debate before we move on to questions. So again, do keep adding questions to the chat if you have any. Thank you, Sue.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm very pleased to be here, of course. Gosh, well, a lot's been said that's been encouraging, which is good, but I just want to go back to last Sunday's World Environment Day, hosted in Stockholm. It focused on only one Earth, with the strapline making sustainable living the default option. And of course, only one Earth was a reminder of the very first World Environment Day held in Stockholm 50 years ago. So as Nicola and others have shown, there's been a lot of activity, there have been a lot of conferences, reports, research, various things have happened to sort of say, hang on, it's our activity that's causing biodiversity loss, climate change, and all these other difficulties. So I think we can say with confidence that we do actually understand the issues. The problem we've got, as others have expressed, is we're just not taking the actions required. We're not moving at the speed we need. So this year's World Environment Day put forward the proposition that policymakers can edit out harmful lifestyles and consumption options and edit in more desirable alternatives. Well, of course, political leadership is very important. We crave it, we ask it, we beg for it. We don't always get it, but political leadership is only one half of the story, because it can only really work if the electorate and citizens and all of us actually support it. So that seems to be like a sort of problem that we haven't yet resolved satisfactorily. And then looking at the Brundtland report, which Nicola mentioned, that was published in 1987. And one of the things I find most interesting in that is the phrase that the critical global environmental problems were primarily the result of the enormous poverty of the South and the non-sustainable patterns of consumption and production of the North. So effectively, 35 years on, our challenge, particularly the challenge in the global North, means how do we radically change our behaviour to live within the Earth's carrying capacity and to meet the report's aim still relevant of what sustainable development means for future generations. So as I see it, the really big challenge is this need for this mind change shift. We need to change how we do things. We need to change our behaviour so that all aspects of our lives demand support and cooperation from all of us to do things differently. And I was really interested in Amy's graph, which showed that only 5% of students thought that behavioural psychology or behaviour change was actually a relevant element, because for me, actually, I'd make that sort of virtually 99% of the problem. So how do we actually inspire people to embrace the necessary changes, from the heart, not see it as a deprivation, but as a positive actions? So of course, this is where schools and nurseries can offer the greatest opportunity, because what I've always felt with school and any educational institution, it's where you get groups of people. It's where you can't do it in your own home. You just have your children and your selected sort of invitees. But schools and universities and so on have a vast community of people from all sorts of backgrounds. And it's that opportunity to get those people together to discuss the issues, which I think are really important to actually resolve how to come up with solutions. So I think schools and universities do have a very critical role in actually creating this mindset change that we do need. And they also provide this opportunity for this sort of more community-based understanding and action. And I think words like community and local are going to be very important going forward, because actually we are going to have to change how we do things, and traveling large distances and so on isn't going to be one of our options. You know, why are we talking about the 15-minute city? You know, it's how we see the future of cities going. So I think we need to bear that in mind, because I think education is probably going to lead the way for the behaviour change that others need to follow. So there's a lot going on in the field. We've talked about that. I do think it would be really interesting to actually have a bit more of a picture about how much is going on and who is doing what, because I'm aware that there are lots of toolkits, there are lots of activities, but you know, we don't really, well, I don't know, and I bet some of you don't know either, all the various things that are happening and how they could be actually used. There could be more collaboration. So for me, in summary to everything that's been said, the big challenge is how do we get that mind shift that actually enables this radically different way in which we're going to live our lives if we're going to have a future. And just on that word future, George Marshall, who's been pretty wise on climate change issues, said, please don't talk about the future, it's now. Because talking about the future suggests that you can postpone, it's later, it's not our problem. It's actually what we do now that is the critical issue if there is going to be a future. Now, I don't want to cause climate anxiety, but it is actually a pretty serious problem. So I'll probably leave it at that and see what the conversation develops from there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Sue. Really interesting and really important point to leave that part of the event on. I'm now going to hand over, I think, to Henriette, who's going to sort of manage the questions. So thank you very much to the questions that have been put in there so far. And some of them might be to audience members, so do be prepared to chip in if you would like. So thank you very much, Henriette.
No problem. Thank you very much. And thank you all the speakers for your very interesting and inspiring presentations. So yes, I'm going to start by putting some questions to you that we received before the talks even started. And so the first one asks, is the OCR's recently announced new optional GCSE in natural history and climate way too little? Apparently it's due to be launched in 2025, and should it be mandatory like maths? And if not, why not? And I think, Nicola, you're going to appoint the panelists who will answer those questions. So.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Emily, I'm wondering if that would be interesting for you to answer, sort of given the fact that many of the views you represented were sort of young people. What do young people think about it? Do you get a sense of the natural history GCSE?
Yeah, of course. I think it's a mixed reception to it. I think people obviously have a huge interest in natural history, and I think it's great that that is now an option. I think with a lot of people getting really interested in things like watching David Attenborough, understanding the evolution of our planet, it's a really interesting field, but it is not climate education. The content, as I understand it, is not teaching about climate change or climate action or ecological and sustainability issues. So I think some of the media coverage has probably made it seem like that is synonymous with the climate curriculum. And I think what's important is kind of making sure people know it isn't. And I think that's the difficulty with not necessarily greenwashing per se, but like the way things are presented in the media. And I think as much as it's great to have these add-ons, so these like climate leadership awards and these extra optional GCSEs, they have to just be extra to the core ask of a climate curriculum.
Thanks, Emily. Sue, you want to come in?
Yes, I just wanted to add, I mean, I completely support everything Emily says, because it's you know, it's vital. But this GCSE on natural history, I mean, Mary Culwell and others have been working on it. It's taken over 11 years to get to this point, and it still won't be introduced until 2025. Now, if this is the rate of change that we can expect from the DFE, given the things that we've all said and the need for rapid action, you know, this is a very worrying signal, is it not?
Absolutely, thank you. I think it's quite interesting because some people have reflected on the speed with which the strategy for climate change and sustainability education has come out. And one of the DFE responses to that is that people are saying it needs to be urgent, so we're doing this quickly. So it's interesting. And I think with the natural history GCSE, I absolutely take on board Emily's points and would agree with many of them. But it's kind of, once the decision is made, it's the bureaucratic, it's the exam board, it's the, you know, it's that takes the process. But actually, I completely agree, and we need to support our teachers now, I would say, from a school perspective, to be doing things across the curriculum now. Yeah, absolutely. Henriette, shall we move on to the next question?
Yes, so the next question we put to the panel, as it says: how useful does the panel find Timothy Morton's concept of ecological hyper-objects to ram home the urgency and sheer scale of global warming?
Thank you very much for that question. I might not be cruel and pick on an individual. Is there any volunteers to answer this one? It talks particularly...
Is the questioner here? Can they tell us more about Timothy?
Yeah, Paul, feel free to put your mic on. Do you want to expand a bit on that? Not sure if Paul's able to do that.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you,
Paul. Okay, I'll just be this disembodied voice. Yeah, Timothy Morton does this stuff about ecology. He uses the concept of hyperobjects is so that you can get a handle on something that is absolutely impossible it defies your common understanding. So examples he gives is like a black hole, which of course we have photographs of now, or something like the half-life of plutonium, 26,000 years. We can't get our minds around it, but with the concept of a hyperobject, it's something that you can actually manage because you have a name for it, almost like naming a demon. So it gives you some kind of capacity to be progressive in managing something that is going to require an extraordinary amount of adaptability. And the question is specifically to Generation Z, more so than the older generations, with all due respect, because they're the people that are going to be on the front line. And I really mean that. And I applaud Sue's point about the future being now. I hope that offers some clarity. Thank you for hearing me.
Thank you, Paul. I think that means that Catrin, Amy and Emily, that's directed at you. So do any of you want to respond to that? Amy?
I can definitely kick off, and the others please jump in after me as well. I think it's a really interesting idea. It's not one I come across before this evening, I'm going to be really honest, but something that I think very, very strongly about this idea of making it real for people. And this comes back to what Sue was talking earlier about behaviour change and this shift of we need to have this heartfelt desire to make this change, to ensure there is a future. And I think that that's a very real thing. And it's something that I probably think about a lot in some of the work that we do, when you're really thinking about how do you place this problem in a narrative that people can understand, that is relevant to their own life, and how can you frame the action that is going to need to be taken, both at a systemic level and at an individual level, in a manner that people can really understand it. And I think that there's a real need to place this huge problem and to bring it back. It's that idea of the future being now again, but to bring it back to what is actually the substance of people's lives and where are the changes they can make within their own lives. So it's about making it very real for people, understanding that it's got to be, they have to understand what the impact might be upon their lives and what they can be doing, and framing it in that way. I'm probably going to stop there, and I think that is very useful, making that objective change like that.
Thank you, Amy. I think that's really helpful. Catrin, Emily, do you want to add anything?
I guess just similarly echoing some of Amy's points is, from what I've noticed from young people, particularly say what we're doing at the Global Centre on Adaptation, is focusing on very like place-based solutions. So on adaptation, you do very much focus on your local community and the changes you're making there. And I think in doing so, you kind of remove some of these abstractions, and it feels like you are seeing immediate results, even if that's more socially transformative results as opposed to the long-term climate effects. And I think in doing so, you kind of remove some of that future thinking and abstraction that kind of can make it difficult to engage.
Absolutely agree. And from an educational perspective, it's sort of a lot of children, young people say they're feeling very disempowered, and it's how to sort of re-empower them, if you like, and that kind of local place-based approach is really important. So thank you, Emily, and thank you, Amy, as well. Hopefully that helped, Paul. Henriette, shall we move on to the next question?
Yeah, let's do that. I think, Sue, you put a topic on the table saying, can we explore green jobs and what we mean by this? And should most or all jobs actually be green jobs?
Sue, do you want to start off with
Should I start answering my own question? So yes, so this was actually, I mean, reading the DFE strategy, that there was that green jobs were high on the list, but they weren't quite clear what they were, and it sort of started looking like you'd be doing waste management or tree management or gardening, and yet all what we're trying to do, sorry, just looking at my own area of the built environment, what we're trying to do is actually say that we would like to see students coming forward from school really understanding these environmental implications, so that every decision that you're make is made in the light of the climate and ecological emergency that we've got to deal with. And therefore, in that light, everything you do is, quotes, green. So it's, we don't want to start ending up finding these jobs parceled up into certain areas. It's a kind of an approach to what work should be going forward, I suppose, is what I was trying to raise.
Thank you, Sue. Panelists, anyone want to take that particular? Catrin, I thought it might be a good one for you.
Yes, I think just building on what you were just saying, Sue, I think not only is it not encapsulating what green jobs within certain disciplines and certain fields, but it's actually within certain individuals. And no longer should we have an environment manager who does all of the sustainability work, whatever that organization defines as sustainability. It should actually be part of every single staff member's skill set and competency base. I return to that word of competency, and maybe actually at a university level, from my position, if we're developing those skill sets within all of our graduates, then all of those graduates have the capacity to be a leader in whatever shape or form that might be. But actually that leadership skill set and that willingness to act becomes something that can be brought into every job. So I think I agree with the concept of not having green jobs. There will always be jobs that are engineering-y or architecture-y, or I'm going to stop there. But actually, how do we start to bring a wider awareness of what sustainability means to every single discipline and every single workplace field?
Thanks, Catrin. Amy.
Thank you. This is really just to build on what Sue and Catrin have already said. But one way that I think about green jobs is thinking about a transition and what things are still going to be happening when we get to a world that is sustainable, or if we get to a world that is sustainable. So we're still going to want doctors, we're still going to want people to look after us when we're old, we're still going to want teachers, we're still going to want people who are going to be running our renewable energy, we're still going to want people who are going to be, and who knows, maybe we will have automated vehicles that are sustainable at that point. I don't know the answer to that question. And so one way that I sometimes think it's helpful to think about green jobs is, what are the jobs that are compatible with a world in which we can live? But I do think that the concept of green jobs now, as someone who works very practically on trying to get students into green jobs is actually a useful one. I think that although there's certainly a lot of quite nuanced discussion, which I really find valuable in the sort of careers world about should actually this idea of green jobs just be applied to all jobs and thinking about the skills students want to take into those jobs, that's really valuable. But I think in terms of students who self-identify as wanting to work in this field, of which there are vast numbers, that if they're trying to explore that, it feels to them at the moment anyway, and it may change in the future, more useful to be able to say, I know I want to work in environmental sustainability, and to know that green jobs, even though they are, the range of them is vast, that there is that they can be pulled into it by that tag. So I think that word at the moment, may not be in the future, is useful at the moment from that perspective. But I'd be really interested to hear, sorry, I'm going to volunteer Emily for Emily's view on that.
No, I would totally agree. I think I would definitely consider myself as someone who's self-identified as coming out of my undergrad and feeling this immense sense of eco-anxiety and almost finding kind of some like solace in the fact that I knew I wanted to work in the green job sector. It almost felt like it gave me a sense of purpose of how to direct this eco-anxiety as I went forward in life. And I think a lot of other young people find that. And I found that there's actually quite a community around young people trying to find green jobs. There's specific places to reach out for them. So I think at the moment, as we are not in a place where it is mainstreamed across all sectors, maybe we obviously want to get there, but we're not there yet. It is useful at this intervening point. And on the broader issue of green jobs, I think it's also important when we're looking at things like the just transition. And I think what Amy was saying about jobs that will or won't be here in the future, it's really important to use this idea of upskilling for green jobs in areas where, say, a lot of people will be working in industries that won't be able to continue, and ensuring that the young people and children who are in these areas are specifically kind of nurtured and fostered to go into these green routes so that their communities aren't left behind. And I think that's something that's not always discussed in the green job debates.
Thank you very much, Emily. I think we might have time for one more question, Henriette.
Sure. So I'll take a pick here. I think to go back to the question about the GCSE, Stephen Day says, it seems like none of you gave this a very warm reception. But also more specifically, should sustainability education become compulsory as a subject in schools? So he didn't feel that he'd heard a clear view on that.
We're all being fairly diplomatic. Emily, I'm going to go to you first.
Okay, yeah, of course. So I think on whether we should celebrate the small wins side of it, I think of course we should always celebrate the small wins, but I think we can't get hung up on celebrating the small wins at the point of that kind of distracts from the end result. I think the reception to it isn't particularly warm simply because it was presented as the solution almost in the media to climate education, which it just isn't. It is just a really interesting GCSE, but it isn't what young people or teachers were specifically asking for. And I do think it should be mandatory, not necessarily as a subject in its own right, but as a mandatory thread throughout the whole of core and compulsory curriculum up until the end of Key Stage 3 and then beyond in your optional subjects.
Thank you, Emily. Amy?
Thank you. I'm really echoing Emily's words. I was really surprised on the day that the climate change strategy came out that all the media started talking about this climate solutions GCSE. And I was like, I haven't heard about this. What's this? And looked up and realised it was the natural history GCSE and was pretty shocked. The natural history GCSE will be a really interesting GCSE to take, as everyone said. It is a small win. It should be celebrated as a small win, but it is not the climate solutions GCSE. I don't think that was talked about in the press or seem to be presented in the press in that way. I am also happy to basically stick my neck out a little bit and say that I think that some element of sustainability probably should be mandatory at some stage in the education life journey that students go through, just because the way in which climate change is going to affect those students across their lives in their physical environment, social environment, work environment is going to be profound, and they need to have the skills and knowledge to be able to handle that.
Thank you. If it's okay if I jump in to give a bit of context as well, perhaps. So one of the concerns with the natural history of music GCSE, although I absolutely agree that it looks really interesting, is that because it's not been put as part of the EBAC, what's called the EBAC, for some of you might be familiar with this and some of you aren't, the EBAC kind of is a list of subjects. Of course, it would have things like English, math, science within it, but there are others, geography, for example, which counts in a Progress 8 measurement, which is a kind of league table accountability measure. So because the natural history GCSE isn't included as an EBAC subject, it isn't prioritised, it's not counted in the kind of what schools are measured against, it automatically means that many schools just won't do it. And that's kind of one of the concerns about it. It's not a concern with the GCSE itself and saying this is rubbish, that's not the point at all. The concern is the reach, which Emily and Amy have referred to, in terms of it's GCSE, so it's optional anyway, and actually what might happen is that not many schools even provide it as an option, so children aren't able to take it. So that's kind of more of the concern, it's around that. And I just want to echo, I completely agree, and I think Emily, you referred to this, and this is very much the fundamental driver of the centre that I work within, is that it should be embedded across all subjects. It should not be left to an individual subject, because it is a transdisciplinary subject. It shouldn't be just one on its own. It will then be seen as separate to everything else, that people kind of think, oh, well, it's just a bit relevant over here, it's not relevant to everything else. It should be within all subjects, I would argue. All disciplines are responsible for it. The historians have a perspective to give, the geographers have a perspective to give, the mathematicians have a perspective to give. And if it is embedded across all disciplines, and teachers of all disciplines are able to do that, then it will become much more significant, and students will understand it as a holistic approach and problem, but also holistic solutions, which of course are the type that we're going to need. And I would also agree, it absolutely has to be from primary through Key Stage 3, and of course up into Key Stage 4 and 5. The other thing that has happened, just to add, is the environmental science A-level is another example. So that is also great, but hardly anyone takes it. So it's great to have these options if you really want to specialise, but there should be an entitlement, as far as I'm concerned, for all children and young people to get climate change and sustainability education. So hopefully that's a little bit less on the fence. Sue?
I wanted something to leave us with. It sounds to me, listening to all this, that we need to really rethink education. You know, what actually are we trying to do for people? How are we going to actually better prepare people? Where's our duty of care, that we have a responsibility to make sure that people are actually prepared for the kind of world that they are living in, need to live in? And people are arguing about the minutiae, about whether an exam board can accept a topic. I mean, come on, we need to, you know, how do we actually push those kind of things?
Absolutely, and what a great place to finish. Thank you, Sue. How are we going to, as a community and the Lucy Cavendish community, address some of these issues that we've picked up? We've kind of got lots more questions and we haven't found many solutions, but it's great to be having the dialogue. So thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Henriette for the final comments. Thank you, Henriette.
Yes, I think there is not much more that I would want to add to this, except to say thank you once again to all the panel members. It's been really interesting and so good to have you on the Live from Lucy talks and to bring this discussion to the whole Lucy community. So I'm going to say thank you very much. Have a good evening. Also to the audience, thank you for being there. And maybe we'll see each other in a couple of years and see how much progress has been made. That would be lovely, wouldn't it? And I'm saying just a couple of years, not more than that. Lots of progress there. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.